Hello! If this is the first video of mine that you are watching, welcome to my channel, but if it is not, welcome back. Today, as you can tell by the title, I am going to be talking about the Licanius Trilogy and my thoughts, because I have finally finished this trilogy, and I have a lot to say, I think. So hopefully this one won't be too long, but we will see. Before I get into the review, I do want to acknowledge that if you have watched a few of my videos, you will remember the construction noise that I was contending with next door. Now, oh so lovely and oh so luckily, they are re-pointing the brick on my building. So I have that noise to contend with outside. If you can hear any of it, I am so sorry. I might try and put in some like background noise to soften it so it's not quite so noticeable, but fingers crossed I can win this battle. Just a disclaimer, this is just my opinion and Spencer is going to try and jump on the table. Please no, good boy. Okay, and then you don't do that. No, come on up. Good boy. There's little hairs going everywhere. Surprise, surprise. Okay, we have had a guest join us. Spencer has decided that he wants to be part of the video, so I'm gonna let him curl back up in my lap. The books are now over my shoulder. I hope you don't mind. But one final thing before I dive into the books finally is my distilled beverage of choice for today's video. I have made myself a dark and stormy because the morning here began very dark and stormy. It's now just foggy, but I still felt it was an appropriate drink and one that I am quite excited to enjoy, because if there is anything that video a few weeks ago taught me, it's that alcohol does make dealing with construction noise a little bit better. So there wasn't much of a gradient left in this drink, so just gave it a wee stir there, and cheers. Yeah, that's good. You can't see, but Spencer is trying to lick the condensation off the glass very hard here. It's so hard to aim a straw at your mouth. So a bit of a summary about this trilogy, and before I even get to that, a bit of a disclaimer again. If you know me, you know that pronunciation is not my strong suit. So I pronounce this trilogy the Licanius Trilogy, I think. I also pronounced the author's name as James Islington. However, I've now watched a few other videos and I think it's James Islington, that I shouldn't be pronouncing the S. So I'm just gonna refer to him as James throughout this video. We're gonna get on that first name basis, and it is going to be the Licanius Trilogy by James. I have spoken about this trilogy a few times before on my channel, but if this is the first video of mine that you are watching, this is an epic high fantasy trilogy. You can see where the author has been inspired by the likes of Robert Jordan with The Wheel of Time, Brandon Sanderson with the Stormlight Archive, Patrick Rothfuss with the Kingkiller Chronicles. And I've said this before and I do still believe it, even though those elements of inspiration are quite strong, I do think James was able to inject enough of his own unique spin to the story in order to keep it engaging and interesting and fresh. That is not to say that there weren't a few scenes or parts or character attributes that had me kind of grimacing a little bit because they reminded me so much of a different character. I think if you are a die-hard fan of one of those series, you might not be the best person to read the Licanius Trilogy. I think it might just be a little bit too similar for you. If you are someone who can recite to me what exactly happens in chapter 34 of Knife of Dreams, then I don't think that this is the series for you, because I think those similarities will be too grating. However, as much as I am a Wheel of Time fangirl, I don't have the best memory. And I think that worked in my favor for my enjoyment of this trilogy, because I was able to separate them into two different boxes and just enjoy this series for what it is, which is a really fun take on some classic high fantasy tropes. So on that note, we have in this trilogy kind of the chosen one boy savior trope. A lot of things come easily to him. That is not to say that he doesn't struggle. He does struggle in this series. However, he definitely has some natural ability that if that's something that bugs you in your books, it might bug you a little bit in this one. I can kind of dismiss that because I, at the end of the day, want my characters to succeed, and I kind of love the chosen one trope. I'm okay with admitting that. So this trilogy starts out in an academic setting, but we don't stay there for very long. Islington, James, gets the plot and the ball moving quite quickly. I would say this trilogy is much more plot focused than character focused, and I'll get into a little bit of that farther when I talk through each specific book. But we do follow four main characters. We have the split multiple perspective, which I adore in my fantasy, and we have the threat of something from the past that everyone thought had been handled, had been dealt with, suddenly re-emerges. And one of our main characters, I'm pretty sure this is on the back summary, so it's not a spoiler, but a power that was thought to be long lost following a war which took place 20 years ago, suddenly re-emerges in him. And then the ball gets moving, consequences kind of start springing up, and we have to deal with that. With our characters, we have to deal with that. So again, overall, I enjoyed this series. I didn't love it. It's not a new favorite, but it is one that I would recommend to readers who especially haven't read the Stormlight Archive, the Wheel of Time, the Kingkiller Chronicles, because I think if you enjoy high epic fantasy and you perhaps haven't read those series or didn't enjoy those series, then you might really like this one. Okay, so the first book, The Shadow of What Was Lost. This very easily, I would say, is my favorite book of the trilogy. It didn't reinvent the wheel, pun intended. However, it was still a fantastic debut that I think is so well deserved of those 4 stars that I gave it. I did have a few gripes with it. I found the dialogue to be really clunky in this first book especially. There was a lot of world building which took place in info dumps, which was just a lot to absorb and really flung me from the text whilst I was reading it. And then while I really enjoy our characters, they are incredibly selfless and self-sacrificial. They kind of just go with everything that takes place in this book, and there are massive upheavals and really traumatic moments that happen, and I don't think any of our characters really are seen to stop and pause and reflect on what they've been through. It's just full steam ahead. I need to save the world, so I'm going to do whatever it takes, even at personal cost. I'm willing to do that. But with our 4 character perspectives, it did feel a little bit strange to read about all 4 of them being so selfless and not having any moments of doubt. So while I found them to be realistic in their relationships and how they got angry at one another and overstepped and then would be smitten and would have to apologize and all of these very real emotions, I found that to be super realistic. On an individual level, I found them to be a little too selfless to be believable, but that could just be me and how much I adore gray characters. Then at the very end of this book, we do get a little bit farther into the diverging storylines and the threat of this god or godlike enemy, and I really enjoyed that. I loved the foreshadowing of what was to come in this final battle. Again, I think this, while it may not be the strongest book in terms of the writing, I do think this might have been the strongest book in terms of plot and plot delivery. So after I read the first book, something I really wanted from the second book was a little bit more character development, character exploration, and really fleshing them out to be a little bit more rounded, a little bit more believable. Unfortunately, I didn't quite get that in An Echo of Things to Come. I rated this book 3 stars, and for me, it suffered from second book syndrome, which a lot of series do, and I find that in my reviews, I tend to find this more often than not to be the case. When I read series, the second book always pales a little bit in comparison to the first. So a bonus to this is because the world had mostly been built up already, it didn't remind me quite so much of Brandland, so I was able to enjoy it that little bit more without having those similarities smack me in the face. There were a lot of flashbacks and memories that composed this book, and for me, that made it drag a little bit. I totally understand why flashbacks and memories are important because of who one of our main characters is, and also how important time travel is to the story. However, I always found those sections of the book to drag just that little bit longer. Another reason why this book suffered from second book syndrome for me personally is that it really felt as if the majority of the book was just spent making sure that each character was in position for where they needed to be for this final battle that was being foreshadowed in the final book, which, I mean, obviously that's kind of the purpose of a book between books in a trilogy. However, I wanted a little bit more from the plot, or if we were going to be spending so much time with our characters just moving about, I really wanted to experience that character development and that character growth. And still, even at the end of this second book, our characters felt so black and white. And that is a large part of why I think this trilogy didn't really work for me personally, is how heavy-handed morality is and how big of a theme morality and free will versus destiny becomes to the trilogy. And it just didn't click with me. It just didn't resonate, unfortunately. And I think one of the reasons why it didn't is because none of our characters felt gray. They were so black and white. And I think when you're discussing morality, you really need to show some of that conflict. And there were hints of it throughout the trilogy, but it was really obvious almost. You kind of knew what was going to happen, so it didn't actually feel like a conflict when you knew what the end result was going to be. I love character-focused stories, and I love really nuanced characters because I find them to be incredibly realistic. And unfortunately, I didn't find that to be the case with this trilogy. And finally, the final book, The Light of All That Falls. I had such high hopes for this book going into it. I gave the first book 4 stars, the second book 3 stars, but I still enjoyed it, and I really wanted this book to pull through and give it a 4 or a 5-star rating. However, unfortunately, it was another 3-star read for me. And I think maybe it is because I had such high expectations that I was disappointed going into this. I had put off reading the final book for so long, and I think over time my expectations just grew and grew and grew to the point where I was unrealistically excited for this book, and it just didn't live up to the hype and expectations I had created in my own mind. One thing that I did really love about this final installment is that we finally got to see some gray in our main quartet of characters. There were finally some cracks in their facade, and the repercussions of all of the trauma and turmoil that they've gone through over the last year and a bit was finally visible. They had their doubts, they had their weak moments, they had their moments when they just didn't know how they could persevere, how they could go on. And I just wanted to yell finally, but I think it was just a little bit too late, because at that point, everything was basically already locked in. So even though that gray was introduced, that trauma was shown, and that turmoil was visible, Islington had already made it really clear where things were going to be at the end. And again, morality and the debate of free will versus destiny was such a large part of this book. And I just really didn't buy into the argument that James was making, unfortunately. I really, really wanted to, but the theological exposition was just a bit underwhelming for me, because the consequences didn't feel real enough for me to really buy into it, and I was left a little bit disappointed by how that was all tied up. And then, without going into detail, because I don't want to give any spoilers away, there was one scene or two scenes in particular at the very, very end which almost made me want to just scream out loud, because it felt as if it was underhanding a lot of what had already taken place, and a lot of the argument that was trying to be made for free will versus destiny suddenly just got all called into question for me personally in my interpretation of the book. I think a really simple way of describing how disappointed and underwhelmed I was with this book is just how long it took me to finally finish reading it. I mean, it is a very chunky book. There are more than 800 pages. However, it took me nearly a full month to read, which is practically unheard of for my personal reading pace. And at the end of the month, I'm pretty sure I only sat down to read the book 4 or 5 different times, and I read all 800 pages. So it's not that the writing or the storyline was complicated, although there is definitely some complications with time travel thrown in there. It was just, with that time travel and with those split perspectives and diverging storylines, it made it really, really easy for me to just finish a chapter, realize that we were shifting focus, and set the book aside and not think about it for like a full week. I really just wasn't invested in it by about a third of the way through. Going back to the first book for a moment, one of the storylines that really, really excited me was this talk about ancient gods and how they were going to be important to the storyline. And I felt as if the conclusion to that storyline was a bit lackluster, was a bit, again, underwhelming. I wanted more from it. I wanted that big ultimate final battle, and I didn't quite get that. It was there, but it didn't live up to the expectations that I had created for it in my mind when I think of someone like Sanderson and how he brings those battles to the page. And finally, one last critique about this final book is just the time traveling element of it, and also the further exploration and development of magic within this world. By the final book, everything just felt so convenient. It kind of worked because James needed it to work for the plot. He needed it to do this thing so that the characters could get from this point to this point, so it just magically worked. And I mean, hey, you are the author, you have that power. But I think there is a softer way to handle that and how you can incorporate that into the text so it doesn't feel quite so abrupt or just bam, bam, bam. We need to make this happen and we need to make this work. I feel really, really bad after those reviews because it feels as if I was really, really negative, but 3 stars isn't a negative rating. It's kind of just middle of the road. I enjoyed myself while I was reading it for the most part, but I did have my critiques. There was something or some things holding me back from really falling in love with the world and the characters, and that is the case with this trilogy. It is one that I'm going to keep on my shelf for years to come, and not just because it looks pretty, but because I would love to reread it one day. I still am interested enough in the world and engaged and intrigued by the characters that I would love to revisit that world. I don't know if I will be picking up the companion novel that James teased at the end of this book, but I will definitely be keeping it around and I would love to reread it one day. I'm also really intrigued and interested in maybe doing a comparison video to Wheel of Time, but I don't know if that would be too harsh on Islington, James, because I don't want to be mean or nasty, and I also don't want it to be a slight against the trilogy, but I think it might be helpful for Wheel of Time fans before they go into this trilogy to know the similarities. So I found this with Gardens of the Moon, the Malazan. A big part of why I didn't enjoy it was I wasn't expecting there to be so many similarities with Wheel of Time. So maybe if I had known about those similarities before I went into reading that book, I might have enjoyed it a little bit more. I don't know. I really didn't enjoy that book, so maybe that's not a good example. But I did really enjoy the Licanius Trilogy. And even though the final book fell a bit flat, and even though I described the second book as suffering from second book syndrome, it is such an honor to bear witness to the journey and growth of an author, which is really so apparent in this trilogy. And I love seeing that. I love seeing how an author grows and develops over their career, and because this is Islington's James' debut, it's really apparent and you can really see that. So again, I do not want to be mean or nasty or too critical. These are just my thoughts, my opinions, what impacted my enjoyment of this trilogy, even though I did overall generally enjoy it. Like I've already said, I do think this is a series that you might enjoy most if you haven't read the Stormlight Archives, the Wheel of Time, the Kingkiller Chronicles, or if you've tried to read those series and didn't quite get on with them, didn't quite enjoy them. I think this trilogy might be for you. It would be worth a shot. I think you might enjoy it more. And if you are big fans of those 3 massive fantasy series, bear in mind going into this trilogy that there are some similarities, that there are some elements that James pulled inspiration from when writing his own debut. I think it is a fantastic entry point into fantasy. It is completed, which not all of those series I just mentioned are, and there's also only 3 books, which the one completed series that I mentioned is 14 books. So it's apples to oranges, really. You're not going to get the depth of the world building or the character development in a 3-book series that you will in a 14-book series. I mean, that's just basic understanding of literature, right? So I think that this is a really approachable series, and it's not as intimidating as, say, a massive 14-book series. It's not perfect, but it still has some really great attributes, and one that I think many people will and have and do enjoy. So those are my thoughts surrounding the Licanius Trilogy. If you have made it to the end, thank you very much for listening to my rambling. Let me know down below in the comments if you have read this trilogy, what you thought about it, if you agree or disagree with some of the things that I had to say. I know it's been a few weeks now since my last upload, but I promise I will be back sooner rather than later with my next video. And thank you very much for watching this one. Bye for now. It's essentially become tradition to end my videos with a shot of Spencer, right? Right, Pence? The behind the scenes of what I had to contend with throughout this entire video.